I remember when The Evil Within was being marketed. I was in my final years of high school, and this was being shown off as a game right up my alley. Over-the-shoulder horror game that's full of combat and crazy moments. Around that time, when it came to this kind of horror game, you really only had two options: Resident Evil and Dead Space. The Last of Us Part 1 had only just came out earlier that year. And other than that, if you were a fan of more combat-focused horror, you were kinda starved. Because outside of Cry of Fear or something, another great game, or something like Grey, it was just really hard to find new horror games with combat that weren't just Resident Evil and Dead Space. What was popular around this time was stuff like Amnesia and other indie stuff like Slender or SPC Containment Breach. Indie shit you could play on YouTube and react to, so The Evil Within had my attention, especially because it was from Shinji Mikami. I care less about him being the director of Resident Evil 1 than I do him being the driving force behind taking Resident Evil 4 and rebuilding it into what would become one of the greatest games of all time. That's what had me interested. So I want to talk about both The Evil Within 1 and 2. Because I really feel like this franchise has its fan base, but it also seems to be victim of what a lot of games seem to be victims of. When they're new IPs coming from established talent, and that is, this isn't as good as the last thing you made, because I, for some reason, didn't understand that there's a new title on the fucking box syndrome. Where you have people who both expect you to make the same exact thing you made before, because if you don't, it's automatically of lesser quality. Because it's too different. And also, don't make it too similar, because if you make it too similar, you're simply pulling from your old ideas and releasing the same game again. And don't have anything new and blah blah blah, you get the point. I honestly tend to feel bad for people that make high-profile, critically acclaimed games, because I know no matter what they do, when they want to make something else that isn't that IP, they just can't win. Seen it time and time again. I've seen it with the Callisto Protocol, I've seen it with the Outer Worlds. Oftentimes, this is just how it is. You're not going to please everyone. The Evil Within is a franchise I consider to be a cult classic. Something that isn't the most popular thing compared to its competitors, and is absolutely underappreciated by your stock standard YouTube reviewer or gaming journalist. Not given credit, especially the first game, for what it does. But on the flip side, has a very passionate community that recognizes how special it is. Be warned from here on out, spoilers galore, as per usual, as I will talk about these games freely, from beginning to end. The Evil Within 1 feels like an artist's passionate work, uncaring about the current trends in other artwork, something people were really allowed to stretch their brains and creativity in making. The best way I can describe it is the first The Evil Within plays like it feels to look at a vintage painting. It's weird, it's like, this is pretty good, but the proportions are definitely strange. It feels like a game made exactly the way a team wanted to make it because they had a vision, and didn't really give a shit if it didn't all go together logically. There's a charm to it. For example, what you'll notice is that in the beginning, we're introduced to our stars of the hour. Sebastian Castellanos, Joseph Oda, and Julie Kidman. And 2 out of 3 of them dressed like noir old detectives out of something you might find in the new Alone in the Dark reboot. They get called to Beacon Hospital as a multiple homicide is going down. And you'll notice when they get there that they all hear a high-pitched screech and all react but Kidman. Something very important for later. They investigate the scene, which is an absolute blowout, and find a doctor on the floor. Sebastian gets a glimpse of some wild shit going on the cameras before getting knocked out. When he wakes up, we're treated to probably one of the craziest horror game intros in history. Sebastian wakes up and sneaks his way out of some sort of torture room, but trips a wire like a fucking moron and gets chased around the sewers by some fucking freak show with a chainsaw. At one point, he tags him in the calve, which hampers his movement, which means he'll be crippled for about 80% of this chapter. What this means is 2 things. 1, you'll need to hide from the chainsaw maniac, referred to as the sadist. If he catches you, it's basically game over. Unless you get absolutely lucky here like I did. Hey, nice chainsaw swipe, cucklord. And 2, fuck everything else that goes on in this game. Sebastian is dragging an open, gaping chainsaw wound through sewers filled with liquids like blood, shit, and who even knows what else. If nothing else he encounters over the course of this game kills him, his infection definitely will. Eventually, Sebastian does make it out, and this big deal they just made about how his leg was cut by this chainsaw just basically vanishes. He can now run perfectly fine, and even sprint. What the fuck? Why did you even make me do any of that then? Listen, I like this game. I even like this intro as its own thing. It's tense, it's insane, absolutely crazy. But in relation to the rest of the game, it kinda just has nothing to do with it and even contradicts itself. It's a great first time experience, and I truly mean that, but it's a slog to get through on repeat playthroughs. It's over pretty quickly in comparison to something like Resident Evil 7's introduction, which is 5 times worse to replay. For this very same reason of having absolutely nothing to do with the rest of the game, so I'll cut it some slack, but you know. Thankfully and mercifully, this game does one thing I wish every game like this would do, and allows you to start a New Game Plus run from any chapter you want. You can entirely skip this chapter on repeat playthroughs and start the actual game with chapter 2 and be good to go. And this is why I 100% prefer linear chapter-based narratives in my games. In open-ended narrative games, even if there is a New Game Plus, you have to go through all this kind of shit again. There is nothing that can be done but to just trudge through. The intros for both of these games aren't long enough for me to care too much, but it is worth mentioning. You'll also notice by now that Shinji has done that thing he insists on doing. And that is starting the main character out with a sick jacket and then robbing them of it at the start of the game when they're captured. Now, I would be completely fine with this on its own. I consider it as something that's just easily identifiable as a thing he does. An artist's signature, if you will. The issue is that he takes these jackets away from you and never gives them back. You get all these unlockables in his games, different costumes, different weapons, but the jacket he starts you in are for some reason off limits in his brain when it comes to unlockables. Shinji, cut the bullshit, bro. I'll tell you what, you can have the fucking rocket launcher you gave me for beating the game back, if I can have Sebastian's coat back. It's a worse gut punch in this game because in Resident Evil 4 when you lose it, it's just a coat Leon is wearing. No big deal, trust me, he has several other nice coats. In The Evil Within, this coat has significance. His wife gave him this coat. And put into context with his family and everything that's happened and will happen to him in regards to them, it's actually very important to him. He always wears it, never washes the thing, so that it never loses her fingerprints and her presence, and he holds it dearly because it reminds him of how much he loves and misses his family. And Shinji just takes it away in like 2 minutes after wasting all this time designing it. And you would think he would have learned by how much his fans go batshit over these coats he puts his characters in after Resident Evil 4, and how many "how do I get Leon's coat back" questions he gets, but nope. Bullshit. Anyway, when he busts outside, the hospital in the city, which I forgot to mention is called Crimson City, is falling apart around him. He jumps in the ambulance with Kidman, the doctor from before, and some kid named Leslie. Joseph never made it out of the hospital. There's also the other cop that's been with them most of the way to and from the hospital that I forgot the name of because he's not important. They're driving around the city trying to survive as it's breaking apart until the guy Sebastian saw on the cameras, Ruvik, shows up in the backseat and causes extra cop here to go feral and plunge the truck off a cliff. Once Sebastian comes to, he's being wheeled in a hospital and weird shit's going on. He comes to and meets a nurse named Tatiana, who cons him into getting into a chair that looks normal at first but turns into some sort of weird torture chair. This is where we buy upgrades and save manually. The game has checkpoint autosaves because it's not the fucking 90s anymore, of course, but it still holds on to manual saves for the novelty and for the character. To upgrade in the chair, you require green gel, which you'll find in the world or mostly through defeating enemies. In the back, there's lockers which require keys you also find throughout the world to give you supplies. There's also a little map of Crimson City you can put together using pieces you find out in the chapters to unlock some bonus weapons. Every now and then there's newspapers that you can find in the hospital that hint at events or characters you'll encounter in the next chapter. This is basically your Resident Evil style hub area, your save room. To get here, usually there will be some kind of mirror Sebastian will look through and it will take him back here. Or he'll wake up here in between chapters oftentimes. The chair burns Sebastian alive, and when he comes to again, he's in the wrecked ambulance and everyone is missing. This, without a doubt, is the Evil Within's biggest strength, and what I absolutely love most about this game. The game doesn't really give a shit about connecting the world because it doesn't have to. It's all a jumbled mess, and that frees the team up to do whatever the hell they want. You're never really sure what's going on or what will happen next in this game. Sebastian can walk in a room that is completely fine, and the next thing you know, the door is gone. He can just be walking along in a house, and next thing you know, he's in the hospital again. A room will literally change before his eyes. Something can bust out of a door and run right at him, and then disappear in thin air. A chapter in the game can end one way, transport him to the hub area, and then when he takes the mirror out, he will be somewhere else with absolutely no explanation. Completely unrelated. Chapters can connect if they want to, like chapter 2 and 3 for example, but oftentimes he'll just be somewhere that he can't even explain. And it's great. I love it. Nothing is off limits. Absolutely anything can happen in this game. Is it all scripted? Sure, but who gives a fuck? That works to this game's strength and allows the team to get creative. They can do anything they think of and it will work. As we'll talk about in the second game, this is something you just can't do with open cities and open worlds, anywhere close to as effectively. Sebastian searches around the woods for any sort of survivors and runs across Extra Cop, which I only know now through watching back the footage, is named Connolly. He's a goner, and munching on some dude's brains in a callback to Resident Evil. This is your first taste of the game's combat, and a good time to talk about the game's mechanics and loop. As you would expect, this is an over-the-shoulder RE4 style experience. Throughout the game, you'll pick up pistols, shotguns, snipers, grenades, and the signature weapon of the series, the crossbow, called the Agony Crossbow in this game. It can use different bolts that you craft from parts throughout the world or from picking up in the wild, like standard harpoons, my personal favorite. Through their sheer damage and low cost, Flash Bolt's another extremely useful bolt as it stuns groups of enemies and allows for easy peasy stealth attacks from the front or back, which will usually kill them outright except for with some sub-bosses like the Sadist, with which it just does massive damage. Which is funny to me for two reasons. One of which being that it just dawned on me that the Resident Evil 4 remake allows you to do the same sort of thing with the knife in that game. We've come full circle. And two, more pressing, is that you see enemies in this game don't see Sebastian's lantern, which I assume is for balance reasons, which means they must be blind to light or something. However that works. But if that's the case, shouldn't this flash bolt realistically do absolutely nothing to them? Think about it. Anyway, the other bolts are a shock bolt, good for stunning enemies and freezing them in place. And speaking of freezing, there's a bolt for that too. As you can imagine, a frozen enemy crumples to dust when you shoot them or melee them, which you can do freely. There's also some pre-order exclusive bolts and weapons that I got lucky and managed to snag a code for online, even like 10 years later after this game came out. My favorite of which being the firebolt, which latches onto one enemy and sets them alight and shoots jets of flames in all directions, completely unaliving everything it touches. Which brings me to matches, and matches are extremely important. Now, the game fucks you over when it introduces them to you because it places a match next to a dead body and tells you to burn it. So it's likely you'll assume that dead bodies don't really stay dead unless you burn them or something. And you'll go around wasting matches, and that's not really how they work at all. Well, it's kinda how they work, but not really how you should be using them. Admittedly, what the tutorial text says to you explains it better than what the game is showing you, but the game still places a dead body right in front of them for you to burn. Matches are used to burn enemies that are alive to make them dead. Enemies when they fall can be quickly burned, which is an instant kill. Any enemies caught in the initial light will also take an L. In addition to fallen enemies, there are things in the world like oil puddles and haystacks, as well as dead bodies that can be set alight and can wipe out like 60% of what you're fighting if everything lines up just right. It's probably one of my favorite and one of this game's most unique mechanics because it feels so good when you get it right, and really shitty when you get it wrong. But more on that in a second. See, when this all comes together combat-wise, it's a beautiful creation. You'll be knocking down mobs with one shotgun blast, running up to them and laying down a match, cleaning house like a natural in no time. Extremely ammo efficient, extremely satisfying. And goddamn if The Evil Within doesn't have some of the best headshots in horror game history. Resident Evil's action horror era came close, but The Evil Within's headshots are a sight to behold. Unfortunately, it ain't all rainbows and sunshine. The best way I can describe The Evil Within's combat loop as a whole is fantastic until anything gets in your face. And the problems start straight away as soon as you encounter your first enemy thanks to this fucking camera. I don't know what happened here, besides a motherfucker trying to be hard-headed and thinking that zooming into the enemy's nostrils from 300 feet away from you is somehow adds to the horror. But this is possibly the worst over-the-shoulder aiming camera I've ever seen. I don't know what the hell Shinji was smoking here. What's even more painful about this is that they had this camera right in early builds when they were first showing the game off. I'd argue the earliest camera was a little too far for my taste, but the middle build was perfect. What's even more painful than that? He had it right almost 9 years before this game came out with Resident Evil 4. It would be one thing if he had gotten this wrong because this was a thing that never caught on, but almost every single third-person shooter ever made has used and still uses this camera. Shinji was involved with another third-person shooter that has this camera placed correctly. Resident Evil still uses this camera. Resident Evil 4 was remade and the camera is still perfectly fucking fine. Do you understand how insane that is? They could have literally just picked up a random third-person shooter from their local store, their local GameStop, their local Walmart, or whatever the fuck they have out in Japan, and just used it for reference. What happened? The worst part is that there's nothing you can do to really fix this. See, I'm about to kick a hornet's nest with what I say next, and I don't really give a shit because they can't whoop my ass over it. But I've never really given a shit for field of view sliders in games and think PC players tend to be fucking over dramatic when it comes to a game not getting one. Now, I own a PC these days, but I grew up playing on console, and thanks to Steam's big picture mode, I tend to just treat my gaming PC like a console. Which is why controller support is one of the most make or break things when it comes to playing games on PC for me. You will rarely catch me playing a game with mouse and keyboard on PC, because regardless of the shit that PC players will typically try to feed you about how mouse and keyboard is subjectively superior, there are pros and cons outside of just pointing and clicking. With FOV settings in games, I almost never deviate from default, as I never really need to. Especially with games like this. I'm a purist. I like my shoulder cameras actually over the fucking character's shoulder. And when, for example, the PlayStation 4 ports of Resident Evil 5 and 6 came out, and they'd increased the FOV camera distance to something they called modern, I put that shit right back to classic where it fucking belonged. Well, actually, FOV sliders should be mandatory in every game because blah blah blah-bitty fucking blah. Listen, I'm not saying don't include them, I'm saying I don't give a shit and I'm not going to shed any tears if they aren't included, the same way I'm sure someone who loves boomer shooters as much as I do, but plays them with a keyboard and mouse, doesn't care about controller support in them the same way I do, where I will straight up refund one for having bad controller support. The same way I know there are people that will refund games with no FOV slider. Though honestly, even when games have an FOV slider, that tends to be not good enough for PC players. If they can't see all the way out in the fucking Pluto from the sides of their character's eyes in a world warped into the Twilight Zone, even in a horror game, your FOV slider is not up to snuff. You're lazy and should have done better. Look at this fucking abomination and tell me this shit looks right to you. Go ahead. Lie! You may like how fucking dumb this looks, but I don't have to. Bringing this back full circle to The Evil Within, it's not even like that's what I'm asking for. The PC Game Pass version of this game is an updated version with an FOV slider that no other version has. But the problem is that it's one of those plain one-size-fits-all FOV sliders where the aiming is not independent from the other camera, and I like where the default camera is placed at. But if I want to fix the aim, I basically have to fuck up the camera to try-hard levels for everything else. Not to mention having to download an entirely separate version of the game in the first place where saves don't transfer over. Your best option to deal with a shitty aiming camera is to sprint away to better positioning if anything gets close to you. Which works, but it still feels like you're fighting with the game's jank sometimes. Speaking of sprint, oh my lord, dude. You knew this shit was coming. What the fuck is this sprint? Sebastian sprints like he's 500 fucking pounds and is about to die if he takes one more step. And in most situations, he likely will. What the fuck, Shinji? What is happening over there at Tango Gameworks? We need to talk. This is a seasoned, veteran police officer. He's seen some action, some intense moments. We can tell by his notes and diary entries. And you're telling me this is what we're working with? When I was 150 pounds overweight, miserable, lost in the void, trying to learn Tekken at my lowest fucking low, I could sprint longer than this. That is fucking ridiculous. In addition to that, this game's damage mechanic is absolutely inconsistent. Usually when something hits you, an animation plays. I much prefer this to the old weak ouch animation we used to get in these kinds of games. The issue is that sometimes enemies try to grab you, and if they're up close and they connect, it's not always clear whether they've grabbed you or initiated a hit animation. And the evil within is not very forgiving when it comes to your window to recognize the difference. If you do not, it doesn't matter how much health you have, you're dead. Most of my deaths came from straight up not recognizing the difference between animations in time and not understanding I've been grabbed instead of hit, and the game decided to insta-kill me before I could complete the QTE. Now, these are the three biggest gripes that I have, outside of the fact that Chapter 9 even exists, but we're not there yet. Like I said, don't misunderstand. The Evil Within feels great to play a lot of times, but it also doesn't feel great to play sometimes. I died a fucking ridiculous amount of times during this holdout section, because all these issues were just compounding and blending into one giant shit shake. But when you fight through that jank, fight through the fuckery, learn some good strats, learn to make things work, it feels great. It feels like a game of old, you know? If you've been gaming as long as I have, you'll know what I mean here, but you know how a PS2 era or PS3 era game, you know, you're in trouble, you do a certain attack or an animation or trigger something like a special move, not because it's needed, but because the invincibility frames are helping you dodge some shit that's otherwise hard to dodge. You're gaming the game. That's what I mean it feels like to play The Evil Within. You're manipulating the game, the frames, to do what you need it to do, timing things right, making sure your positioning is right. And how much time something as simple as Sebastian's match throwing speed is all very deliberate and intentional. I don't agree with every decision made here, but I on some level had to admire and respect the fact that there's no fucking way they didn't know something like the sprint speed is short, that the camera when aiming is extremely zoomed in, or any of that during playtesting, and the feedback they got told them that they need to adjust it. But they stuck to their guns and kept all this stuff like this anyway because it was part of their vision, part of the feeling they wanted to put out. I personally just don't think it all works together, but enough of it works to be good enough. As we're moving around this strange, disconnected world, we run into the doctor from early, Marcelo Jimenez, who's looking for Leslie. They search around for a while, even checking Marcelo's brother's house, Leslie's original doctor who's turned and gone insane. What's confusing to me here is that, now that I think about it, as we later learn in Kidman's DLC, this village is only in STEM because it's where she grew up, and everybody connected to STEM contributes to what STEM shows. So does this mean that Marcelo's brother and Leslie are from the same village as Kidman? They spot and find Leslie, but Ruvik shows up and separates Sebastian from the pair. Exploring around, Sebastian runs into Laura, Ruvik's manifestation of his sister. She's extremely resistant to basically every form of damage that isn't fire. I like her sequences and what she does for the game as a whole, but her encounters can be a little bullshit sometimes. The first time she's chasing you, there's a point where you walk down the hallway and a door starts to close, but directly in front of you, one of the game's mini traps activates. And if you're like me, you'll likely see it and think, okay, so I need to time my run through here so that I don't get deleted. Nope, just run right over it. If you don't, you won't make it in time anyway, and then you're soft locked until you die. Like, why even have these spikes activate in front of you then? What did that add? What did that contribute? All it does is mislead you here and punish you for being careful. Which is the main thing this game is trying to teach you by having all these traps everywhere in the first place. Escaping her, we run right into Ruvik and need to backpedal upstairs. This will be the first time he chases you, and just about the only time it doesn't get on my fucking nerves. But more on that soon, as right now we're just kind of freeballing it. One thing I like about The Evil Within are the puzzle traps that get introduced starting here. You guys know me, I fucking despise puzzles. But with this game, they're not too bad. A bit of common sense like, well, clearly if the blood is spattered on this side of the piece, that must mean putting it in this way is what killed the last guy. Or looking at a giant ass wall with Ruvik's notes on it that have the answers on which buttons to push. Nothing too crazy. Nothing too annoying or roadblockish. Eventually we run into Joseph, who somehow ended up here. He'll be tagging along with us. But something isn't quite right with him. At one point he starts to turn and pulls a Leon, but snaps back to his senses. They search around until they run into Kidman, who's trapped into something straight out of a Saw film. When they get her out of here, the ground straight up collapses on her and Joseph, and Sebastian jumps down and search after them. They all regroup until, of course, Ruvik separates them all and sends Sebastian back into Laura's hands for a proper boss fight. Like I said, Laura is mostly fine until she isn't, when everything works right. But if she touches you, it's a one-hit kill. So how painfully slow and deliberate Sebastian's match-throwing skills are can be a real pain in the ass. I don't like terms like gamey, because of course a fucking game, it's gamey. It's a goddamn video game. I wish there was a better word for this, but having her teleport on top of a body, just asking to be burned, only for it to do absolutely nothing because you placed it a split second before her spawn invincibility frames ended, just feels silly. Shinji, she's literally standing on top of the fire, dude. Stop fucking playing with me. Once we deal with that, some weird happenings lead us to teleporting to a strange church area during daybreak. We run into Joseph just laying on the floor here. Wake the fuck up, jackass. He's also lost his gun, so he'll be swinging around this axe from here on out. This is that holdout section I talked about earlier. If you haven't gotten at least passable in skill at this game by now, you might as well just go ahead and uninstall it. Because this is the point where it asks you how much pain, suffering, and jank you're willing to fight through to become a warrior. An unrelenting, fire-slinging, head-popping killing machine. The training here is brutal. They keep moving along until Joseph does that anime thing characters do where they run ahead for absolutely no reason, as no one would ever do that, and he gets captured and you have to save him before he ends up on Live Leak. After we do so, he has a bruh moment, and Sebastian gives the most relatable response to this situation I've ever seen.
What the fuck?
Moving along, we have to take out some giants and run into this weird dog thing where Joseph almost gets us killed over a pair of glasses. And we hit the church up. Ruvik shows up and does that Ruvik thing where he fucks with the world, and next thing Sebastian knows, he's stuck in some sort of underground tomb. There's a lot of foreshadowing for the next boss here. Eventually we find Leslie and run into the Keeper, who is by far my favorite boss in this game and one of the coolest bosses I've seen in a horror game. Look at how fucking hard this introduction is, dude.
Leslie! Leslie! Leslie!
Don't try to bullshit me and tell me combat-focused action horror games don't count as horror and don't have the heart or the soul where it counts, because they sure as shit do. This enemy is pure art. He carries severed heads in a bag in one hand and a hammer in the other. This room is filled with poison gas and we need to clear it while trying to get away from him. What you really need to watch out for is his traps. If you get caught in one and he hits you, it's GG's. Word on the street is Ikumi Nakamura, and I hope I'm saying that name right, the lead artist for this game, designed him, but got a little mad at Shinji because she didn't like the respawn gimmick. She imagined him more as human when she made him, but I gotta side with Shinji on this one because this dude is sick. Every game like this has a moment, an image in your brain. When you think back on the game, when you think of when you want to play it, there's a particular sequence you remember as your favorite. A moment that sort of defines what that game is. For me, this boss encounter is that. Those few seconds where Sebastian turns around and the Keeper spawns in for the first time, and it's like, shit. Sebastian finally puts him down by crushing his head with a trap ceiling, and our search for Leslie continues. We run into Jimenez again, who explains that he and Ruvik were working on a machine to link brains together. This machine is called STEM. They're all trapped inside it, and while they all contribute a little, it's Ruvik who has the most control and can do whatever the hell he wants. A bunch of weird The Evil Within stuff happens, and we end up at Ruvik's house for Chapter 9. And man, do I have a lot to say about Chapter 9. It has everything going for it to make it one of the best, if not the best chapter in the game. But I fucking hate it. What this chapter is about at its core is exploring and learning about Ruvik's history as Ruben Victoriano. This is one of the chapters I remember them showing off when the game was first announced. It looked crazy good. You know how Chapter 1 of Resident Evil 4 is the iconic signature level you show people when you tell them what the game is all about? Or how that signature level for Dead Space 1 is the engine room chapter, Chapter 3. In the Callisto Protocol, it's the Habitat chapter. For this game, that's supposed to be Chapter 9. It has almost everything it takes to be that chapter, and Ruvik fucking ruins it. This is the worst example of a pursuer enemy I've ever seen. Worse than the Lady D mansion in Resident Evil 8, and that is saying something. I thought that was almost impossible to be worse than. Because he has her and her daughter's invincibility, but at least their damage is reasonable if they catch you. Ruvik here is an instant kill. Now, this could work if they implemented him with some common sense, but they placed him in the most sloppy and unpolished way imaginable. From what I understand, for the most part he's on a timer. After a certain amount of time, he shows up and starts chasing you and then disappears for a while. And he can do whatever the fuck he wants, whenever the fuck he wants to. He can teleport right up to you. He can teleport directly in front of the direction you're running. Anything is fair game. This is one of the worst balanced things I've ever seen in a horror game. You could be in a room with only one exit because you just solved one of the puzzles in the chapter, and he will spawn directly in front of your only way out, corner you and kill you because he fucking feels like it. This is not tense, this is not scary, this is fucking stupid. It doesn't help to get caught on clutter in the level while you're trying to get away either. When you die, his timer resets so he won't bother you for a while afterwards, which is the only merciful part of this torture. And if you thought it couldn't get any worse, think again. Enemies in the level don't despawn when he shows up, so if he chases you into a room with enemies in it, have fun trying to deal with them and him at the same time. You might as well put the fucking controller down at that point. Ruvik chasing you around in his house while you look at his experiments and learn his history sounds like a fantastic idea on paper. I understand why they did it. I just wish they had did it better. This level is dog shit, and it's a shame because this is without a doubt the best one atmospherically and lore-wise. We learn about how he's been a genius since childhood. His family was rich and his issues with his parents, and his weird love for his sister. He never got along with his father, but his mother loved him dearly, as did his sister Laura. His family was very wealthy and bought up a lot of land in the village, pissing off the town one day, and they tried to burn him and Laura alive in a barn. Ruvik made it out badly burned, but Laura died. From that moment on, everything changed, and he started to look for a way to create some sort of device to help him live in his own mind. in a reality where Laura was still alive, creating STEM. But to do so, he had to kidnap and experiment on people from the town and city, eventually striking a deal with Jimenez, head of Beacon Mental Hospital, who he knew from the family's donations to said hospital. Speaking of his family, his father found out about his experiments and locked him away, lying to his mother. Eventually, Ruvik broke free and killed them both. This is actually a bit sad because while his father maybe deserved it, his mother didn't. His mother seemed to genuinely love and care about him and had nothing to do with it. Jimenez was working for a group called Mobius and was secretly taking credit for Ruvik's research, but let Ruvik's involvement slip. Ruvik, not an idiot, fail-safed his STEM machine to only work from his own mind, which meant both parties needed him. So they snatched him up, killed him, took his brain, and used it to power STEM. Jimenez then took over his research under Mobius's orders. This was a shit decision because Ruvik here is now the powerhouse for STEM, which is killing everyone they send in. And now we're all stuck in here. Sucks to suck. Sebastian faces off against what I can only assume is a manifestation of Ruvik's memories and hate, and then just gets randomly tossed back into Beacon to deal with Laura again, one final time. Laura, of course, being a representation of Ruvik's sister's pain, which is why she's weak to fire, because it's what killed her. This is probably the best time to mention how important fire is to this series in general, and especially in this game because fire is integral to both Ruvik and Sebastian's backstories. Sebastian married his partner on the police force, Myra. They had a daughter named Lily, that they supposedly lost to a house fire one night, and Sebastian turned to drinking to cope while Myra began investigating the fire, feeling something wasn't right. Sebastian didn't believe her or her theories, and one day Myra vanished. Only then did Sebastian start investigating, ironically worrying his co-workers who didn't believe him either, and thought his wife simply left him. We get plopped back into Ruvik's house and run into Jimenez and Leslie, who he's hooked up to STEM. He tries to explain that Leslie is the only patient that's ever linked to Ruvik and survived, and he's the key to them getting out. But something goes wrong, and Jimenez realizes that Ruvik is actually using Leslie to get out of STEM before he too gets turned into paste. And we have to fight whatever the hell this thing is. Yes, I know I keep interchanging Jimenez and Jimenez. Leave me the fuck alone, dude. Now that he's dead, it doesn't even matter. Next thing Sebastian knows, the elevator he gets in takes him into the city. This is chapter 11, and the point at which the game becomes a lot more action and combat heavy. Consider every 5 chapters as acts. Now, if you're fucking boring, this is probably the point in the game where you think it's poorly paced, or is too action-packed, or something else. I don't even need to go look at the reviews of you-know-who to predict that's the complaint they've had, because they're all one-trick ponies. But if you've actually been paying attention to Shinji's work up until now, you're likely already familiar with his action-packed third acts. It is so fucking weird to me that a lot of these popular horror game review channels act like they're so versed in this field and just don't fucking pay attention. Like, this isn't anything new, this is his style. All I'm saying is don't act like you're such a fan of the guy's work when you barely fucking understand it. If you're using that cranium of yours for anything other than occupying space, you'll notice that Shinji's games typically go on structured from something like Evil Dead 1 to 2 to 3 over the course of the entire game. On top of that, it always makes me laugh when the horror game Tunnel Vision Gatekeep Task Force is ready to collectively piss themselves when they see guns and shooting in their horror games because that's quote-unquote not horror. When what they're not telling you is that horror games have had enemies with guns in them since almost day fucking one. Alone in the Dark, considered to be the grandfather of survival horror to Resident Evil's fatherhood, had enemies with firearms in it that would shoot at you. By the second game, this isn't some great betrayal or blasphemy to the genre. So the next time you see some drone regurgitate this guns are bad for horror games narrative because they've been watching too many video essays on amnesia, remind him it's been around in the genre since it started and to eat shit. Assault rifle go... That's also no shade towards those games either, because they're actually very good experience, but this game was also around the time of Outlast, Amnesia, Soma, that sort of walking simulator indie horror craze. So what happened And I saw this with my own eyes. I was fresh out of high school around this time, with nothing to do but watch YouTube. This was back at the tail end of the old golden PewDiePie and Markiplier era. Is that you had people like PewDiePie playing The Evil Within, then dropping it after a couple of parts because he realized this was a legitimate video game with combat and complexity, beyond just walking around and running away from things. Which is even weirder because he proceeded to play and then drop The Evil Within 2 for the same reason. Like he didn't learn his lesson the first time? What the fuck, Pewds? I guess part of this is Shinji's fault for this beautiful but misleading introduction to the game that didn't help some people's perception of what it would be and how much action it would have. But on the other hand, I have to fucking wonder why the hell people expected a full retail AAA product to play like the indie games they'd been churning out videos on daily. We also pick up that trusty horror game staple, the Magnum, around this time too. Though I'm not sure if you can get it earlier. Unlike a lot of horror games, The Evil Within gives you multiple chances to pick up most weapons in case you missed it back in a previous chapter. So it's likely I missed it earlier. As Sebastian explores more and more of the city, he runs into Kidman again. And as they're looking around, he comes under the same control as Joseph, and Kidman seemingly shoots him. He wakes up completely fine though, and Kidman ditches him. He runs back into Joseph, who seems fine now, and has found a bus that Kidman just hijacks. Next thing everyone knows, they're being chased around by a giant spider. I think this section in particular shows why I'm not a fan of restrictive ammo counts in these kinds of games. Because what can happen is you seeing a stack of bullets the devs put here so that you can resupply if you needed it. But if you try to DPS the boss and use a couple of clips, you can end up killing it before you have a chance to resupply. Basically fucking yourself. Once we deal with the spider, our plan is to get back to the light at Beacon Hospital, as whenever they get transported, it's always somewhere nearby. So the theory is that it's gotta be the most important place to be at. Joseph gets sniped, and we have to look for a health kit for him, from a random ambulance that they see outside. I'm torn between the idea of just fucking continuing to drive towards the hospital that would have supplies, and the idea of checking the ambulance that's more dangerous to get to, could very well have zero supplies, but is closer. Anyway, after Joseph is patched up, Ruvik tells our bus to fuck off and we crash into a building. When Sebastian wakes up, the place is covered in traps and the Keeper is back and stalking around the halls. We deal with him one final time, where we're trapped in a meat freezer with him and need to find a way out. Making it out of the building, we run into Kidman just as she's about to shoot Leslie. And while Sebastian has a standoff with her, Joseph shows up and tries to sneak Leslie away from her. But he lets out a scream and runs away. Kidman shoots Joseph accidentally while trying to hit Leslie. Sebastian falls through the floor for like the millionth time and comes to in the subway tunnels. This is also around the time we find out in the hub area that Tatiana went missing from Beacon long ago, from reading a newspaper. And after we read it, she completely vanishes for the rest of the game. And the hub area will have a blue, ghostly hue to it every time you visit it from here on out. To get out of the tunnels, we'll have to power an elevator and deal with this weird cloaking tentacle boss. Sebastian legworks it back to Beacon and the game comes full circle, taking us back through areas we originally visited, even somehow being physically present for the video Sebastian saw on the cameras at the beginning of the game. Ruvik is about to give Sebastian a game over, but he smacks him with the lamp, setting him on fire and bringing down his whole fury, teleporting him into this weird nightmare world for our final gauntlet of the game. I found this pretty tough, especially when Leatherface here shows up with a rocket launcher, gets mad and then trades it for his chainsaw again. Two Keepers being our final skill check before the big finale. After Metal Gearing our way through tripwires, searchlights, and another grinder, Sebastian ends up in a weird room looking down on himself, and everyone else through a glass ceiling. Leslie walks in, running from Kidman, and while the two argue, Ruvik makes his move and absorbs Leslie. Everything then proceeds to go tits up. Ruvik transforms into a huge monster. This final battle is more of a huge set piece than a real final battle, and while I'm sure that's going to be a complaint for some people like it always is, I really don't give a shit because it's cool. And I like these a lot more than the same run to one corner of the room, shoot the boss, then repeat over and over to avoid its attacks things that horror games have been doing for 1,000,000 years since the dinosaurs roamed the earth. I'd argue this is way more fun. Sebastian gets a little ahead of himself and gets impaled, and lucky for him, he finds the most convenient rocket launcher I've ever seen, and pulls a different handgun than his revolver out to finish the job, because I guess the devs forgot which fucking gun they gave him. And then he puts a stop to this once and for all by destroying Ruvik's brain. He wakes up back in the real world with Kidman standing over him. She tells him to play dead, and he does. When he wakes up again, he finds himself with everyone else dead in the other tubs. SWAT arrives, and when he walks outside, he sees Ruvik successfully having transported his mind into Leslie, escaping into the real world. This ending confuses me, not because of that, because if STEM kicked in when they were all in the police car after Jimenez activated his prototype, what the fuck happened to the hospital staff? And how are they all killed and actually scattered all over the place in the real world? Who even did that? Were they all pulled in when he did that? In which case, it's wireless. So why did some of them, like Sebastian, get wire plugged into STEM? When did he get wire plugged into STEM? You guys know me by now. I'm a gameplay and combat first, story second kind of guy, but it wouldn't be honest if I didn't point out some of the plot holes here. Some of which get filled in by the DLC, which we'll talk about now. Specifically the 2 Kidman DLCs, because the 3rd Executioner DLC is completely irrelevant. The first DLC in question is The Assignment, which picks up at the end of Chapter 1 when the ambulance crashed. Kidman encounters Connolly, who's transformed, and attacks her, throwing her off a cliff. Through a flashback, we find out Kidman is a double agent for Mobius, the company that owns STEM and Beacon. Jimenez was trying to activate the STEM prototype under their noses, and Kidman is tasked with getting Leslie and bringing him back there so that he can power their STEM there. Ruvik controlling STEM is making shit difficult, so they mean to transfer power over to Leslie. They give her an injection to hide her from Ruvik's eyes in STEM. She's also working as a plant in KPD to be their eyes and ears in there. So they send her in with Sebastian and Joseph, her partners, to keep Ruvik's attention on them so that she can slip in and out with Leslie with less problems. Waking up in a nightmare version of Mobius, she starts to search around. Here, let's go ahead and discuss the gameplay loop in comparison to the main game. Some of you that have watched my other videos where I've referenced this might know this, but I didn't like this DLC. And I'm not really a fan of this DLC type. Like I said, this is during the stealth indie horror game fad, so they had plans for a Kidman stealth DLC and a Joseph stealth DLC. But I guess Joseph's DLC got scrapped for the Executioner. I'm simply just not interested in paying money for you to take my fucking weapons away and then make me hide and run from shit for hours on end. That is boring to me, and this was a slog to get through. This is for who it's for, but who it's for is not for me. I'll give credit where it's due. It tries better to explain the main story. The flashlight is an interesting mechanic. I like that the camera sticks to Kidman over the shoulder when she sprints instead of zooming out like it does with Sebastian, but I'm simply not interested in the core gameplay loop. This DLC focuses on stuff I'm not really attached to in horror games, like puzzles, and less of the shit that I actually care about, like dealing with enemies that are actually trying to kill you. And even the weapons that you get suffer from what the DLC is at its core. For some reason, Kidman is too fucking stupid to know how to swing the axes that Sebastian can pick up in the main game, if an enemy is looking directly at her, so she can only swing it from behind enemies when they can't see her. On top of that, we're back to pitiful sprint duration. Add to that the main event enemy of this DLC has a mechanic where if it sees you, it literally fucking slows you down to catch up to you, and it just makes everything a fucking slog. And I mean a slog to get through. It makes Julie look weak and useless, and that feeling over her being kind of worthless at dealing with this stuff compared to Sebastian never really left me. The only time I was ever having fun with this game was when it was exploring Kidman or Sebastian's backstories, or when I had my gun in my hand, which was usually only briefly for a set piece before the game took all the fun away again. What the DLC does have going for it are improved stealth mechanics that the base game doesn't have, but could have used. Julie can use corner cover, she can lure enemies by yelling or throwing bottles, and a lot of the jank that the main game had as far as hiding, feeling useless, a lot of times is done away with. Story-wise, it's just about her searching around for Leslie while having flashbacks of her past for most of this DLC, while she's chased by this monster that's a manifestation of her search for Leslie. As far as her backstory goes, the village areas that Sebastian were exploring in the main game were where she grew up, with parents that didn't really give a shit about her. so she left home and joined up with Mobius to feel wanted. As far as progress, she really doesn't do much of note in this DLC until Ruvik specifically notices her running around Stem, and figures that Mobius sent her in, so he puts her in the Jigsaw water trap from the main game. I'll admit that it's interesting seeing time and space for Julie basically bending through her eyes, which explains how Sebastian typically ends up getting thrown around with zero idea how he ended up there either. But you can see events from Julie's perspective because she's immune to the Stem signals that make Sebastian and Joseph go crazy. It's around the last hour of the DLC when things start to really get going. You can see things like Sebastian going crazy and running off, and we even have a boss fight with a transformed Joseph who knows all about what Julie is really here for. I like this fight. The game can make it a little clearer that there's an entire series of rooms you can hide in and not just this circular hallway that loops back on itself though. When she puts him down, she gets thrown into her childhood house and village for a bit of lore, where she actually finds Leslie. And the game continues to insult me by having her point her fucking gun that I can't use, even though she clearly has ammo for it, at Ruvik and Leslie, while Ruvik reveals to her that Leslie is his plan to get out. He's under Ruvik's control. She then decides she has to kill Leslie, and a projection of the administrator from Mobius gets pissed off at her from stepping out of line. And the last 2 minutes of this DLC give us the most interesting thing to happen this entire time. You have to avoid the directions his hands swipe from, and also be paying attention to when you're turning corners to make sure you don't turn into a direction he's chasing you from. And that concludes the end of the first story DLC. The second one, The Consequence, is better, but is still mostly a stealth-focused DLC. When Julie wakes up, she's in Beacon again, in the hub area Sebastian usually ends up at, running into Nurse Tatiana, and realizes they knew about Leslie and what Ruvik's plan was all along and just didn't care. Around this time, she also breaks her flashlight and is stuck with glow sticks for a while, reminding me of the good old days of Cry of Fear. Longlegs here wastes no time going right back into pursuing her again, and for a while absolutely nothing of value happens until Kidman hits the rooftops of the destroyed city and catches a glimpse of Sebastian from below. Around here, the game finally gives you back your gun and lets you fucking shoot something. Fucking finally! Yes, more of this shit, please. We run into Longlegs one last time, only now the DLC has decided it wants to be a proper video game again, so we get what feels like a proper boss fight. You need to shoot out its lights without it seeing you so that it can't stun you. Once we put it down, we get transported to the point in time when Sebastian saves Kidman again, and we see it from her perspective. She shot Ruvik, not Sebastian. After separating from him again, she runs into the administrator, who chases her into the bus she ran into and hijacked in the main game. She's also shocked to see Joseph both alive and completely unaware of her secret, or their fight from earlier. We pick up right after the bus crashes, and right about now I fucking had it with this DLC. Julie's reaction to them taking away my gun again is my genuine reaction. Every time I'm starting to have fun with this DLC, they fucking kick me right in the balls and I'm tired of it. If I didn't need to play this shit to explore the backstory, I'd likely never touch it again. I've had enough. To add insult to injury again, Julie runs into Leslie again and Ruvik begins merging with him. We get these arenas where we have to burn paintings of him scattered throughout the rooms while killing or avoiding enemies, and we need to be quick about it or we'll fail. And all I'm thinking is, where the fuck did my gun go? I'm tired of this shit. And then Leslie turns out to have our gun. He saves us by shooting the final Ruvik painting. But then when we get the gun back, it's completely empty and we will never have ammo for it the rest of the DLC. Except for this cutscene, of course, where Julie is firing it off, hits Joseph while chasing Leslie, so she clearly has fucking ammo for it. She chases him back to Beacon, where, in a further slap to the face, she snatches a shotgun off an enemy, and instead of letting you balance your pistol and shotgun ammo, the game just hands you shotgun ammo for a shitty shotgun that only holds a single shot per reload, but your enemies, with the same shotgun, I mean literally the same exact fucking shotgun, do not have to reload it at all, so they can just shoot you over and over and over again while you try to fucking reload this thing and you can do nothing about it besides run and hide. Who the fuck was in charge of making these two DLCs? The final gauntlet to get to the boss is horrible. It's designed like something from the main game, with how enemies are placed here and there, what to deal with, but the only thing you have is this slow reloading shotgun. And you are at the game's mercy when it comes to whether an enemy will get to you before you can reload this thing. It feels like this shit was balanced under the idea that you would have both the pistol and the shotgun to work between, but then someone forgot to put the goddamn pistol ammo drops in, or even worse, had them in originally, but then took them out because they thought that you only having the shotgun would create more tension and didn't play test the shit to know that it didn't work. After the standoff with Sebastian where Leslie gets absorbed, Kidman is pulled into the final battle with the Administrator and two evil clones of herself that are actually pretty freaky to fight. The game slaps me in the face one final time by handing her a fully loaded handgun to put him down out of nowhere. And when Julie blinks again, she's back in the real world, where we get a teaser that Myra, Sebastian's wife, is still alive. We also see Joseph dragged away, so clearly he's still alive. I can only hope that Myra here at least checked on Sebastian and we didn't see it, because the idea that she not only willingly participated in sending her fucking husband to Beacon, but didn't even check on him after being 10 feet behind him at the end of this game while he lays in this tub unconscious, makes her seem like a horrible wife. She didn't save him or spare him. Julie did that. That's ridiculous. And that's The Evil Within 1 summed up. The main game is great, but it feels like art that's missing a final pass. The DLC is some shit I will probably never touch again. These days, it typically comes bundled with the main game on Game Pass for both Xbox and PC. But if I had paid money for a worse experience than the main game by far, I would have been pissed. I consider this game a shining example of why I prefer traditional, linear video games, as opposed to this non-linear, open-ended, bloated, convoluted bullshit we get now thanks to mainstream gaming circles. And it's time to talk about that, because Sebastian's story isn't over. This is a duology after all, and it's time for things to get a bit more personal with The Evil Within 2. The Evil Within 2 starts with a flashback to the night of the fire that took Sebastian's daughter. It's one of the worst times of his life, and his guilt and grief takes the form of this nightmare. When he wakes up from it, he's in a bar, drinking his troubles away. Kidman shows up, who he hasn't seen since the Beacon incident 3 years ago. In that time, Sebastian has lost his job as a police officer. Kidman tells him that Lily is alive and that she and Mobius have her. This pisses him off, of course, and they sedate him and kidnap him. At Mobius, the Administrator explains that they've improved and revised him after the Beacon incident, and Lily is the core power source of the machine, as her tests are off the charts. But her readings have gone dark, and the new stem is falling apart, so they're willing to work with Sebastian to find her on the inside. You'll likely notice this by now, but almost all of the voice actors have changed. This is pretty jarring at first, and I prefer the delivery in the original game, especially Sebastian, who had this smooth old-world detective feel, whereas he just kind of sounds like an anime character in how he speaks now. It's improved on paper, but in practice misses the charm of the original game's vision. That's going to become a recurring theme with this game. Plugging into STEM, he's transferred to his old KCPD office, and is briefed on the team that's already been sent in to look for Lily, and what the plan is. The new STEM is designed not around the core's mind, but instead to be an entire town called Union, where people live, as sort of a virtual perfect neighborhood. If you're thinking Silent Hill, you'd be right. We also get our first slide, with a callback to the cat that Julie used to save in the first game's DLC. These slides are one-on-one talks with Kidman, about whatever subject is usually on the slide. The trusty old mirror takes him back to a random building in Union, and you'll notice right away what I noticed all those years ago when I played this game for the first time. Sebastian's movement speed is horrendous in this game, good lord. You will be sprinting 24/7 to get anywhere in this game with any sort of agency. He comes up on the team leader he was supposed to locate, capped right in the head and stuck in some sort of weird limbo, looping the moment over and over again. Exploring the building, which seems to be some sort of museum/apartment complex, he runs into Stefano, the main antagonist for the first half of the game. He's the one making these murder limbo cubes. This section also introduces the game's improved stealth mechanics carried over from the Julie DLCs. Continuing to look around, he runs into Stefano face to face, who snaps his photo, and then we get this crazy ass moment with this mirror. And in a chase similar to the first game, we book it out of here, barely making it out alive after Stefano tries to fuck us over with this knife, and that will become our trusty old stealth tool. All in all, I'll say this introduction is on par, and arguably even better than the first game, just because it's more thematically consistent with the rest of the game. You still get the crazy atmosphere, the huge chase piece, and all that. And I'd say this lives up to the expectation and corrects the original game's decision to cripple Sebastian for no real reason. I don't mind redoing this intro every time I play this game, whereas I can't say the same for the first one. Sebastian picks up a handgun. He definitely would have been in a lot of trouble if he hadn't conveniently spotted it on the way out the door to the house he got thrown into, and he comes across an infected in the house up the hill. The enemies are similar to the ones from the original game, only this time they ooze stem slime. The combat here has been improved as well. The camera isn't fucking zoomed into the nose of whatever you're aiming at anymore, and is placed reasonably with the default pistol. And head pops are just as beautiful as you remember them to be. But it can still absolutely break apart anytime anything gets close to you, so make no mistake, it's still got issues. But it's less clunky than in the first game, yet just as stiff, if that makes sense. Running along, he comes across two Mobius members. One of them gets the old game over, and after getting embarrassed by Sebastian for being a little bitch, the other one introduces himself as O'Neill, a hardware expert. He fills Sebastian in on the location of a signal that could be the core, and says he's staying in a safe house and hands him a communicator. Heading back through the mirror to the KCPD office, we find a chair that takes us back to Beacon and to Nurse Tatiana's, who returns to do the usual. Upgrade our abilities with green gel and open lockers for us. She's very important to keeping this game's identity in check. Something we're about to talk about now, because once we head out O'Neill's safe house, the game opens up for better and mostly for worse in my opinion. See, this open world bullshit ticks the open-ended good, linearity bad box. I cannot for the fucking life of me figure out why it has become so popular of an opinion in the YouTube critic sphere these days. But when you hear someone say that this game is better than the original, this specific reason tends to be the sole standout, and I disagree completely. This open world shit is serviceable as what it does, sure. It's not bad, but to make it happen, the Evil Within 2 had to give up what made the first game special. Every single chapter and encounter in the Evil Within felt like it was designed that way because that's what they wanted to do. This was 100% their vision. You remember encountering the invisible enemy for the first time? Where you walked into a room and were honestly confused and shocked. That what the fuck am I looking at feeling. Compare that to encountering something like this first Shambler creature here. You could come in from a million different angles, and not only would it not feel as special or have the same spectacle, like something like the imposter Ruvik showing up for the first time and shooting those hands at you, or the sadist breaking free from its chains and chasing you around the village in Chapter 3, but because there's so many variables that come with making this area open, you could literally pass by here from any direction, intentionally or unintentionally, not even know this thing is here, turn the fucking corner, have the shittiest luck, and have it be staring right at you before you've even had the chance to assess the situation. Or when you first find the new and improved crossbow. When you start Chapter 3, you're intended to circle around all the enemies here and grab it. That's why the cutscene to grab it has you hiding from all the enemies here it assumed you didn't kill. But you could absolutely not even come around this way because you didn't know any better and ruin the entire intended way to go. Shoot straight down the street and then the cutscene just becomes weird to look at. You remember how if you missed a weapon in the first game, the game would usually have multiple opportunities to collect it as the story progressed? Not in this game. If you miss a weapon, you just miss it. And sometimes these can be in some of the most random spots and corners. It's not like the two open world areas are necessarily bad or anything, they work. There is some fun to be had just exploring different areas on the map and seeing what you can find in trash cans and searching around for ammo patches and additional weapons. It's got all the bells and whistles you would expect out of what the modern mainstream reviewer considers to make a good game these days, you know. Searching every nook and cranny for crafting materials, mandatory and forced open-ended level design, with a checklist of shit to do that I don't give a fuck about because I just want to get through the main story. The only thing that's missing is a fucking life bar over everything's head, and forcing you to upgrade your pistol to level 4 or it won't do any damage to the level 4 infected. Then it'll really be a modern game that soy feds go crazy for. 10 out of 10. But it just feels like it's doing what the world expects it to do on paper, to the detriment of what made the original so cool. And that creates a blander, more seasonless experience to me. This level in the original is set in the woods because that's where the fuck they wanted it to be set. This level is set in a haunted mansion because that's where the fuck they wanted it to be set. This level is set in a bloody nightmare world because that's where the fuck they wanted it to be set. Most of the Evil Within 2, for the sake of cohesion and modern standards, has to be set in the same city location while you just run back and forth through it with nothing getting remixed but enemy placements. It just makes the game feel like the ideal stock standard survival horror game just doing what it thinks people want it to do. And less like The Evil Within 2. That sense of never knowing what is going on or where you'll end up is gone for a good portion of the game until you get to a more linear chapter, or you're in the underground marrow areas. Those focus down on the uniqueness of the villains, the atmosphere, the monsters, the imagery, the art direction, like the first game did. Till you get to an area that focuses on one of the villains, or any sort of special encounter that deals with Sebastian's beacon trauma, you'd be forgiven for forgetting you were even playing the Evil Within game specifically. The only thing saving the open world from being completely disconnected from the Evil Within as an IP are the anima encounters. This creature is considered to be an unexplained anomaly in STEM that seems to be making citizens into these monsters in the first place. She's not tied to any sort of main story path. When she shows up, the world turns blue and gets cold, and if she sees Sebastian, she will turn into one of those things. It's said that no one can hear her or see her but the specific person she's targeting, and she's the best thing this open world has to offer. Which is crazy, because if you know me by this point, you know that I genuinely hate stealth sections. It's why I didn't like Julie's DLC. But these sections are special because they're lore related. They do something for Sebastian's character, finally allowing him to let go of the part of himself still stuck in STEM, clinging to Beacon. You get a reward in the form of his old revolver for beating the final one, and they are entirely optional. She only shows up if you have initiated one of her dedicated encounters, and from there on in, she has about 3 total encounters that you have to do to get the reward, but can show up randomly in the world. If you don't want to deal with her bullshit in her random world encounters, you can turn right around and run away until she disappears. On top of that, this has the common sense to fix the problem of Ruvik in Chapter 9 from the first game, where he would just spawn regardless of whether any enemies were around. So you can't be robbed because a fucking monkey designed how her encounters will function without playtesting. They actually did this time. It's not just that that's taken a hit thanks to the open world decision either. With open world comes the shit that open world games have to sacrifice because it's simply impossible not to. So well presented, well framed cinematic cutscenes are still here for the main story, yes, but not for characters that you talk to out and about in the world. Take for example, Sebastian and O'Neill here. The introductory cutscene here looks good. It looks fine. But then, as soon as it switches to doing the arbitrary list of dialogue that you can click on for exposition thing, where you talk to him for more info, it immediately switches to this low quality RPG thing that RPGs do, because giving proper cutscenes to all that dialogue just isn't feasible. Look at this shit. Am I playing The Evil Within or Final Fantasy? What this leads to is a feeling of just being bored and uninterested in the dialogue that isn't in a real cutscene to me. Which becomes a problem because there is this one bit of dialogue that is extremely crucial. Torres, a character that you meet later in the game, tells you she's helping you and Myra try to take down Mobius to make up for the bad shit she used to do. One of these things in question that she never tells you, even as she's dying, is that she is personally the one who kidnapped Lily and set their house on fire. She is the reason Sebastian's family is Mobius's property now. She's the reason Myra has to die to save Lily. She's the reason his daughter has been tortured for years. Everything. If you didn't exhaust all the dialogue trees from an NPC directly after Torres dies, you would never fucking know this, because I didn't know this until this second playthrough. Why the fuck is such important information not in an actually dedicated cutscene? What I'm trying to say is that The Evil Within 2 is good. I'd even argue that it's really good, but if you compare it to the first game, it lacks that passion, where you can tell someone was really excited about what they were building, and it lacks the style. It lacks the charisma. Look at the difference between stealth kills here to see what I mean. The first one is smooth. It has this intentional cinematic feel to it. It's all one carefully crafted motion meant to look a certain way, meant to look otherworldly. The second game stealth kill is good. It's not bad, alright? That's not what I'm saying. But it is less stylish. The enemy just flails around as Sebastian struggles to kill it like he hasn't done this a million fucking times. It just looks more like what you would expect it to look like, and not what The Evil Within looks like, if that makes sense. And that's the best way to describe my attitude towards The Evil Within 2. That it feels like an AI-generated improvement doing what the algorithm told it to do, without a real person behind it. If The Evil Within 1 was an artist's unfinished painting who died before he had one final chance to look it over, The Evil Within 2 would be an AI-generated attempt to redraw it in a new style. Sure, it did a great job, sure it looks good, I'm not gonna lie to you and tell you that it's not good work, but it's gonna lack that soul and the strokes of the brush of the original vision. The intentional colors and feels of rooms stripped away because everything needs to be sparkling, vibrant bullshit or it looks quote-unquote dull. There aren't even matches anymore, dude. One of the most unique mechanics in The Evil Within, completely missing. In another game where fire is very important to the narrative, and the main gimmick wrapped around the hero and main villain again, just completely gutted. Then you have other weird changes that are just done for no reason. Like, you remember how important and useful flash bolts were in the original, as they allowed for frontal stealth kills? Well, someone got the bright idea to take that away from Sebastian and make it a fucking upgrade you have to pour points into. Why the fuck would you do that? Or how about taking the Magnum, a horror game staple, the boss gun, Old Faithful, and making it a new game plus reward instead of something you find along the main game? What the fuck was going on over here at Tango when they were making these kinds of decisions? On the bright side, someone decided to throw in the shooting gallery from Resident Evil 4, so someone out here is giving good ideas too, and Tatiana's complete lack of enthusiasm while she cheers you on knowing that she is 100% genuine in her incitement while she is physically incapable of showing it is very charming. Anyway, once we're free to look around and explore and get some gear and supplies, we make our way to her last known location, a diner, where we see she's being chased and clearly running away from something. We track her all the way to a warehouse where, as it would turn out, Stefano is the one chasing her, and he's kidnapped her. To get to him, we'll need to cut through the City Hall, but since Union is falling apart, City Hall is upside down and floating above us, which we can't get to without going through the Marrow, which is the tonnage and passageway connecting STEM together. Think of it like the back rooms from the memes or something, only with actual ways out to take you through different parts of the city. As I said before, I have more fun in the Marrows than I ever do up above in the city. We can get to City Hall, all hell breaks loose for Sebastian, ambushed by one of Stefano's guardians. And without the open world bullshit to get in the way, this game can finally stretch its legs and just be The Evil Within. Stefano's gimmick is that he's a murder artist. In the real world, they clearly didn't take too kindly to his antics, but here he's free to do what he wants, with some sort of time slowing or stopping powers. His sections are a real treat, with paintings and sculptures of death and the grotesque. Here, we need to find and power some sort of generator that will nerf his control in this area and help restabilize Union. We have a showdown with one of his other creations outside of the Guardian, the Obscura, some sort of weird creation made to look like a human tripod camera, holding it off long enough for the emitter to start and do the rest. Once that's done, we need to find where he went next, because he didn't have Lily with him. He's kidnapped her to turn her over to Father Theodore, who's offered him a deal in exchange for her. We need to find our way to his giant-ass eye in the sky overlooking a theater. Traveling through the Marrows again, we run into some interesting stuff. Some weird white-like goop that looks like someone took one look at EO Sky and emptied the whole tank. And even run into a monster made from it that we can either fight or sneak around. This stuff, as we later find, is actually tied to Myra and her related powers. But, searching along, we run into Hoffman, the team psychologist, and continue our way to the theater. It's blocked off, and to unblock it, we need to piss off Stefano by destroying his art. Along the way, running into Skies, the operative with the most interesting side mission, which mostly amounts to a multi-part quest to find a back route out of STEM that doesn't require Lily. The problem with which being that it's extremely risky. The success rate is low, and a lot of people who they tested this with ended up trapped in a void with no way back, so the project was abandoned as a failure. Sykes decides it's worth it, but Sebastian decides it isn't worth risking Lily's life like that. Once we teabag Stefano enough by breaking his shit, we can enter the theater, where he does something that is absolutely wild, and Jigsaw collars an entire room of people. This cutscene is obviously pre-rendered, so I imagine there was just no way of getting this to render correctly on any hardware of the time. Stefano has decided to call off his deal with Theodore and take Lily for himself. And with that, it's time to put this motherfucker down. His boss fight is actually one of the better ones in the horror genre as a whole that I've played. There's a lot more going on with it than just running from one end of the room to the other over and over and over and over again anytime the big monster gets close to you. He's even got an Albert Wesker style rush attack that can do a shit ton of damage if it connects. When we kill him, we finally find Lily, who's in disbelief since Mobius told her we were dead. Out of nowhere, Myra shows up completely transformed and corrupted, and Sebastian can't reason with her while she takes Lily away. Sebastian is confused as to what the fuck is even going on now, because we know Myra is still alive if we played the consequence, but he didn't know she was still alive and likely thought Mobius kidnapped and killed her for getting too close. Without the open world here to get in the fucking way, the game is allowed to pull the classic The Evil Within tricks, like teleporting Sebastian somewhere crazy and throwing him all over the place. We're now in Father Theodore's lair, and like Stefano, the game is at its best when you're in his domain. Now we're fucking talking. This is what I play The Evil Within for. That sense of where the hell am I at? What is going on here? And this place is definitely not friendly. Literal lakes of blood, torture devices everywhere, its own distinct color palette that can really sell the atmosphere because it isn't concerned about some dickhead on YouTube complaining that games are too gray. Wah. I know I've been hard on the stuff that I don't like about this game, but I can't stress enough that once you get through all the bullshit, once they say to hell with all this open world shit and just focus in, this is without a doubt just as beautiful of a creation as its predecessor. This game is so good when the IP can just be itself. I remember when this game came out and places like Game Ranks before you buy were like, the open world sections are brief and gone too soon. And I say fuck that, they're not gone quick enough because this is where the good shit is at. When Sebastian gets to Theodore, he tries to manipulate Sebastian into joining him. He won't give up where Lily and Myra are unless Sebastian agrees. Sebastian, of course, tells him to blow a dick, so Theodore throws him out. When he wakes up again, Torres introduces herself, and we have our Resident Evil style holdout section. I will never get enough of these, they're horror game royalty. Once things dies down, Torres explains that Myra, Theodore, Kidman, and her all had a plan to get Lily out of here and take down Mobius from the inside. But something has clearly gone wrong because she hasn't heard from them since they entered STEM. Sebastian explains that Theodore has turned on them and wants Lily for himself, and Myra has turned into a monster. And making it to her safe house, they go over a new plan, which is hopefully to snap Myra back to her senses by killing Theodore. They need to talk to O'Neill, who might know more, but he isn't responding. And neither is Hoffman, so something is clearly up. He's called her to a restricted part of the Marrow that they are forbidden from accessing. On top of that, O'Neill is a fucking coward and wouldn't leave the safe house he found, so something is not right for him to be willing to go on a hike all the way to this restricted area. When Sebastian gets to him, O'Neill has become a harbinger, one of Theodore's best soldiers, having been manipulated by him into helping him go into hiding. He's also been ordered to kill both Sebastian and Hoffman, though I have no idea why he found Hoffman first but tiptoed around the idea of killing her and went straight for Sebastian when he showed up. Maybe he has a thing for her or something. But once he's out of commission, he comes back to his senses and tells us that the machine in the next room is hiding Theodore. Once they destroy it, Theodore gets pissed and throws Sebastian back into his nightmare world, where he plays on all Sebastian's guilt and tortures him. In a panic, to avoid Theodore's control over his mind, he accidentally shoots Torres, who does her best to drag him back to Hoffman before she dies. While he's unconscious, an apparition of Myra comes and gives him a pep talk that he really needs, and says that he needs to forgive himself for what happened and that focus on not failing now. When he wakes up in the real world, Torres is dead, and Hoffman comes up with a plan to get to Theodore's stronghold in the middle of Union. The game also tries to wave away the fact that Sebastian is guilty for shooting Torres, because the wound wouldn't have killed her. The monsters that she fought did. But you can miss me with the bullshit, dude. A gunshot is a fucking gunshot, and it clearly did enough damage to where it allowed them to take her out. We just saw her clearing out an entire house. I'm not buying that shit. Sebastian pretty much killed her no matter how you slice it. Once Hoffman finishes the machine, it's time to walk our way to the stronghold. Unfortunately, she doesn't make it to the end, and now Sebastian is all alone in this. Fighting his way to Theodore again, his old tricks won't work anymore, so he has one final card up his sleeve, and it's without a doubt the best moment in the game. Theodore sends Sebastian back to Beacon to deal with the worst thing that's ever happened to him again, and we get a boss gauntlet against the best of the Rogues Gallery, as Sebastian takes them out one by one. My favorite moment of which being him fucking up the sadist with his own chainsaw. This is what I love about these games. This is what I love about horror in general. That feeling of how someone in one of the most dangerous situations they could ever be in can go from an average Joe being hunted to a hardened badass that turns into the hunter and becoming the threat, oftentimes going on to make an entire career killing these things. When these channels are spewing you bullshit about how a game in a long-running horror franchise inevitably went into a more action-focused direction as their protagonists get more experienced over the courses of games, or hell, over the course of a single one, and act like they have zero idea why this happens, or that these don't go on to create some of the biggest horror franchises of all time, especially in film, they are lying through their fucking teeth to you, straight up bullshitting. Action horror is a classic staple of this genre. It's been in horror films since the longest time. It's been in horror games damn near since the goddamn beginning. The only way they couldn't be lying is if their memory is just shit or their brain is just sitting in their skulls doing jack shit in the form of processing information or storing data in those memory banks. If you wonder why I'm so hard on these channels like Sphere Hunter and Avalanche Reviews, this is why. Because from the time I was a teenager to a young adult, I had to listen to these people get on these microphones and just fucking lie. Straight up con their audience into believing that these are great betrayals to the horror genre. There was some dark age around the mid-2000s to early 2010s when that was never the fucking case, and I see right through the fuckery. Anyway, he drops all his traumas one by one. First the sadist, then my boy the keeper, and finally Laura. And every single encounter is done justice. Out of options, Theodore is now scared out of his goddamn mind of Sebastian. Love to see it. Just then, Myra shows up and kills Theodore, but she still hasn't come to her senses and she runs away. Now, Union is almost completely destroyed. He needs to find her and Lily and get out fast. Chasing her around, they briefly talk. Myra's maternal instincts have caused her to go crazy instant. She's abandoned her plan and decided to just try and stay in STEM with Lily forever. Sebastian is still determined to save them both, and follows her all the way to their home, where Myra forces Sebastian to have to fight her, and so commences the final battle. Good fight. Once Sebastian knocks some sense into his wife, she explains that she can't leave. He has to leave with Lily, because the only way to stop Mobius is for Myra to become the core and self-destruct. Mobius' staff all have chips in their heads that she can send out a self-destruct frequency to. Without it, they'll just hunt them all down. Back in the real world, the administrator gets ready to have Sebastian killed. Well, Kidman tells him to blow a dick and starts a shootout in the building. He's removed her chip already so they can't fry her with it, and I love this sequence. I'd bet my left nut some channel somewhere is bitching about it in their review. And why am I playing a cover shooter now? Boo-hoo. And to that I say, fuck whatever they're talking about. Shit's hitting the fan right now, and we're balls to the wall, and I love it. The transitions between Sebastian and Kidman back to forth, as this is all going down, are really cool and really well done too. When Myra explains to Sebastian the plan, he's fucking devastated, man. Just watching this gives you that bad feels. She says goodbye and apologizes for everything, including Beacon, and says she's watched him all these years unable to say anything. As Sebastian leaves, Myra sets off the self-destruct codes in the ships and kills everyone at Mobius. With everything over, they're all free and the game ends. And that's The Evil Within as of right now. Now, there have been hints of a third game being teased in Tango's newest game, but I think as far as Sebastian and Lily goes, they should leave them the fuck alone. I think their story is safely concluded, and I haven't mentioned this before, but Julie says in the last slide you collect that Joseph is still alive and somewhere safe. And if they're going to make a third game, I hope he gets the lead. People like his character. He's a good dude. He deserves it. Each of these games is great, despite me not really agreeing with some of the direction The Evil Within 2 took, and some of what was sacrificed to make that happen, but it's not to the point where I feel like it's going in a bad direction or anything. I just prefer what the original is. Some people want what The Evil Within 2 does, which is quote-unquote shake up the formula or what the fuck ever, and that's not what I look for in sequels. When I think of what a good sequel does, I think of Max Payne 1 to 2. Just like the first game. Nothing crazy changed, nothing crazy rearranged. If it isn't broke, don't try to fucking fix it. I think that The Evil Within 2 has better gameplay, by far. It's more polished, mechanics that needed touching up were improved, but I think The Evil Within 1 has a better world, and is a better overall game. It's a better package. And that is completely okay. A lot of people have it in their heads, thanks to the rise of fucking morons and hate bait channels on YouTube, that if you like the original or the first game better than a sequel, that makes the sequel bad, or disappointing, or something, and that's simply not the case. It's an unrealistic expectation to think that you're always gonna like the sequel better than the first game. And you're setting yourself up for misery if that's how you think. If it's not as good as the first game, is the sequel still good? Even if they tried some different shit and it didn't work out to you? Yes? Okay then, that's what matters. And overall, I'd say this franchise is very special and it wrapped up pretty nicely. Both two great games. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed. At the time of writing this script, Street Fighter 6 is out, so I've been playing a lot of that. I've also been binging a lot of modern Final Fantasy games like 15 and 16. The Tekken 8 closed beta is also out right now, so I've been hitting that up as well before it's gone. So I plan to start Resident Evil coverage eventually, hopefully soon, but gaming is also in a great state now. So I have to make time to just chill and play games too. That's one of the biggest mistakes I made early in this whole YouTube thing. As well as make sure I'm not sitting on my ass all day getting fat and out of shape again. Which is another huge mistake I made in this whole YouTube thing. Trying to balance out real life. This isn't my job, so it takes me a little longer to work on these videos because I have to balance them around my life. Anyway, I hope to see you again soon, hopefully. Resident Evil is my next target, so strap up, it's a long ass series, and we're in for a ride.